Hi, everybody. Welcome to Stay Late at Dallas Cedar Center. My name is Morgana Woodborn. I'm the Director of Education, and I am so excited to be joined today with Dr. Jennifer Culver. We are going to be talking about Something Grim. It's the new immersive piece at Dallas Cedar Center that was devised by Tiffany Nicole Green. She has directed with us for A Christmas Carol, and she was one of the touring directors for Hamilton. And we're so glad that she was able to come back and work with our Briley Resident Acting Company on devising a new piece during this pandemic that allowed audiences to come to the Wiley Theater in the Arts District and go through an immersive arts piece and storyline and performance together. So I'm excited to just have this conversation and really dig into the history of fairy tales and how that has transcended into what we see today. How have the themes, continued to be universal and relevant to audiences? But first, I'd like to ask you, Jennifer, how did you get involved with being interested in fairy tales? That was part of your doctoral study, right?
Right. My PhD studies focused on where rhetoric happens in the moment of fairy tales, because as I was watching my own children grow up and as I was teaching school at the time, one of the things that I noticed was the fact that these fairy tales just linger and they stay with us, and they shape us from very early ages all the way up. And in fact, my 18-year-old the other day was debating with her friends which one of the several Cinderella movies is the best one, even though they watched them when they were 7 or 8. And so it was that sustainability of fairy tales, but also what I wanted to get into was, how do fairy tales teach us what it is that they want us to learn about life? How do the lessons happen, and where does that moment take place, and what lessons do we pull from it? In my dissertation, what I did was I looked at 21st century film versions of several different fairy tales. I looked at over 30 of them to finish my work. And what I wanted to see there too was not only how did the tale transform to stay relevant for us, but I also then dug into the reviews and comments by young people to see if they were pulling lesson wise from the fairy tales, what at least I thought the fairy tale was trying to teach from that, and to see what they were learning from these retellings of fairy tales today.
And that's what's powerful, because we've seen, sorry, my dog, we've seen fairy tales transcend, in different ways, or retold in a modern setting, retold differently throughout history, storytellers who took on the same type of story and it had various takes, and we've seen, just like as you mentioned, exploring that as you saw your children interact with these stories, but from Walt Disney to, various storybooks, et cetera, et cetera. And yet there's still something powerful about how these stories stay with us, teach us these ethical and moral lessons. But what's interesting about the Brothers Grimm is that their stories had an edge. And I want to dig into that, because in this play, Something Grim, it's literally grim. There's some dark moments. And we're looking at, manipulation. We're looking at murder, suspected murder, lies, and dethroning and things like that. So as we look at the Brothers Grimm, why did they create such storylines? What was, their reasoning to, have these kind of real harsh tales just to teach us a story?
The Brothers Grimm are such an interesting pair, because what they started to do was they started to go around Germany and they were collecting tales. They were collecting tales from mainly older women, and they called them kinder and household tales. And what we see, though, is throughout the versions of their stories, they changed them themselves over time. I think that's one of the essence about what makes a fairy tale, is that it has some flexibility to it so that it can stay relevant for us. And one of the things that you can find in almost all of Grimm's fairy tales, and it's the thing that we still kind of look for today in fairy tales, is that we want to see the people who make the right choices get rewarded, and we want to see the people who make the wrong choices get punished. And so when we look at the Grimm's version of Cinderella, for example, which we know isn't the first one. There are so many tellings of Cinderella before Grimm, same with Little Red Riding Hood. But if we look at Cinderella, for example, in the Brothers Grimm version of Cinderella, when Cinderella goes to the ball, she goes 3 different times. She has 3 different tests before she goes. And when the prince comes to have everyone try on the shoe, it isn't just that the stepsister's feet can't fit in the shoe. The stepmother actually has her own daughters cut off parts of their feet so that they will fit into the shoe. And so they fit into the shoe, and then there's blood coming out of the shoe. And oddly enough, the prince doesn't notice that, and he'll take them away thinking he's got his bride. And then a bird will fly overhead and say, "Look down, you've got the wrong person." And then he'll come back. And then it happened again with the second stepsister. She cut off a different part of her foot to fit in, and the bird comes back. And so finally, when they pull Cinderella out of where she is and they put the shoe on her foot and it naturally fits, at the wedding, those same birds peck out the eyes of her stepsisters. And in the original, but in one of the Grimm's versions of Snow White, for example, Snow White's stepmother attends the wedding with Snow White and the prince, but she's put into these shoes that force her to dance until she dies. There is an interesting, I chose the Snow White cottage for my background today, partly because it was fairy tales, but Snow White was the first animated film that Disney made. And in some of the Snow White stories of late, there have been some stars and other people talking about how they don't want to talk about Snow White anymore because she's asleep and the prince kisses her, and that there's an issue there of whether or not that's what she wants. But in the original Grimm's tale, that isn't how it happens. In the original Grimm's tale, when Snow White eats the apple, it gets lodged into her throat. When the dwarves are carrying the coffin away with the prince, they stumble and the coffin shifts and it comes out, and the apple falls out, and she does wake up. And she does actually choose to stay with him. So there are some interesting moments about retellings and assumptions about fairy tales and how they stick. But Grimm always, no matter how many times they redid something or revised something, one of their original Snow White versions, for example, it's Snow White's mother who does all of this to her, not her stepmother. But Grimm starts to come up with some characters that we now look for in almost any fairy tale. We look for absent mothers, for example. We look for devious and evil stepmothers. We look for somebody who's trying to profit or trying to gain from something in ways that aren't ethical. And yet we see people demonstrating some of the things that you talked about before. We see people wanting power. We see envy. We see manipulation. We see all of those kinds of stories. And Grimm writes about all of them throughout their tales in very, very different ways.
And I find that, just looking at the different characters in something Grimm, we see, the characters that always want something, will go at whatever length, like the farmer behind me and the cook will go at whatever length to get it. You see the king and the queen, you see the common people, the nobles, like the idea of wishing, making any kind of dreams come true, but being careful about that. And what's interesting when we look at these archetypes and how they connect to certain themes, I think of something that the director Tiffany Nicole Green mentioned. She said, Grimm fairy tales peep into humanity's darkest corners and expose the sides of us we try to hide or present, which doesn't exist. Few are bold enough to go there the way the Grimms do. The lessons they teach are rarely attacked from such an angle. Most people don't want to admit how horrible we can be to one another, but we can't change something we're not willing to admit exists, which kind of goes back to what you said with, we want to see the people who do right, prosper, the people who do wrong. So, using some of the examples of stories, how have the Grimm brothers shown that, we can't admit how horrible we are to one another? Because in these stories, they are literally grim, they are dark. People are really exposed. Their evil, their dark shadow parts are really exposed and shown to the world, despite the fact that they try to hide it or manipulate. So I really want to go into that, is how we don't want to admit to these dark parts, but stories like this really dig deep into that.
Sure. If we look at another popular Grimm's tale, for example, if we look at something like Hansel and Gretel, here we're looking at a family who does not have enough food to survive. And poverty was something that was very, very real in Grimm's time period. And some researchers who have really looked at that period of time and looked at some of those archetypal figures, like the stepmother character in tales like Hansel and Gretel or Cinderella or any of the other ones, really sometimes are positing that what we're really looking for is a woman who might be privileging her own children to survive over another, but truly we're talking about survival over another. But in Hansel and Gretel, there are no other children. There just isn't enough food for that family of four. And so when they decide to send the kids out to the forest, it really is letting the forest have the children so that as the adults they can have enough food to survive. That I can't think of anything darker and grimmer than taking two small children and just leaving them and abandoning them in the forest. But that forest is a huge archetype in Grimm's fairy tales, because the forest is where all of the trials happen. That's where all the testing happens. And that's where what you do and what choice you make will depend on how you have your outcome at the end. And so Hansel and Gretel's parents don't make great choices about how things go. So Hansel and Gretel, they make the best choices they can make in the time that they have for the age that they are. They find themselves a way back more than once. And then when they get to the witch's house and Gretel really realizes that it's really the witch or them, she does what she has to do and gets the witch in the oven and shuts the door to free her brother and come back. At the end of Hansel and Gretel, what's interesting is that when they come back, the stepmother's not there anymore. And in the woods, that's why I think the Sondheim musical is called that, is called Into the Woods, because in the woods, we find out who people really are. That's where the deepest choices have to be made. That's where you are really looking at your own mortality. Snow White and the huntsman, for example, takes her into the woods, but look at the choices that are made there. Snow White, to me, demonstrates a great resilience throughout her tale. At no point does she give up or does she give in to despair. She just keeps trying to survive. She keeps trying to find a life for herself that doesn't need necessarily castles or any of that, but she just wants to live. The huntsman makes an ethical choice there and rewards, and he's somewhat rewarded for that, not when he gets back to the castle, but in the story he is, because he lets her go. He knows that it's not right to take her life. She goes then and continues to make those choices that help her continue to survive. We also see not great choices happen in the woods. Red Riding Hood, for example, in the woods, doesn't make great choices. She's told to go directly from one house to another house. She is led astray. She is led off the path. She's lured into these other areas. And in the Grimm's tale, she's devoured. In the Perrault tale, that's older than the Grimm's tale, she's devoured, and that's the end of the whole story. The Grimm's tale, the huntsman comes and rescues her and rescues everyone. But that's an interesting way to end that story, because the lesson in that one really was supposed to be, don't wander off the path, don't talk to strangers, don't do things that can lead you to a really bad end. In fact, at the end of Perrault's version of Little Red Riding Hood, there's even a little verse that he has at the end that basically is warning young women that wolves can also be on two legs, not just four, and that you have to watch out for them. So Grimm has Little Red Riding Hood survive that event so that she has another event then that she has to learn from. She's learned to test whether or not she's learned. And the second time that she's faced with a wolf, the second time she's faced with a kind of danger, she has learned from the first time. And then she does have her happy ending. So the darkness always really does happen at a time where somebody's real nature is going to be tested and that person's true nature is going to come out. And you're very right that these fairy tales really don't hold any punches about how dark things can be, how self-serving some people can be, how greedy some people can be, and how predatory some people can be.
Wow, that was powerful. And thank you for unpacking that. And something that, as we look at these lessons, there's this one part in the play, which is at the very end by the wishing well. And I really want to dig into, I know much of your study was in the rhetoric, the language of it. And just looking, where people in the theater were used to verse, were used to lyric. And in this, the wishing well says, the farmer's ambition was reckless forsooth, and yet what he taught you was God's honest truth. Your powers do not make you master, you see, and those lacking your powers are not servant to thee. The power of wishes and sweet plums and wealth were granted so that you might serve and might help. So why do we see, in these pieces, the need for rhyme, for lyric, as we go into language, rhetoric, lessons, memory. I want to kind of go into that. And what are your thoughts on as we use language and the way that it's written and presented?
I think the wishing wells verse there is so powerful. And I think that, like other writers before this one, we turn to verse to create something that stands out from everything else, because it's so important that we want it to last with that person in some way. We want the rhyming nature of it. We want the beat of it to be something that that person will go home thinking about. And a lot of what the wishing well says are a lot of things that we would want people to go home thinking about and talking about after that. Because with everything else that happens based on the plot of something Grimm holds a lot of those same Grimm-like moments where people can make big choices that impact not only their lives, but the lives of many others around them. And what I liked about Something Grim as well is that it really did show how one person's choice or one couple's choice really did trickle down and affect so many others. And the couple really didn't think about that when they made that choice. When they really didn't think much at all when they made that choice. But the wishing well is there with that verse as a reminder of, here's what to walk away with. Don't necessarily just walk away with the fact that somebody made a wrong choice and that person didn't end up well. Walk away with how that applies to you, the aspect of choices themselves, the aspect of power themselves. when you get your own chance to make a wish or to make a choice, how will seeing something grim help you come back and think about how that choice affects others?
So, in looking at also something grim specifically, now you uh, broke down how various authors have, approached the different stories. Now we've added on the layer of how do we approach these stories today? Literally, when an audience member goes through something grim, they're hit with audio, lights, they're hit with reading visuals, pictures, video, tactile moments of touch, movement. Um, so, in looking at that, I want to unpack how have we seen through the years in which fairy tales have been depicted, how they've been shown in the media and revolutionized so it stays relevant. And right now, we create this immersive experience in a mid to post pandemic life. So, I want to really unpack that and get your thoughts on your experience through this and your other experiences of watching or reading fairy tales in different ways.
What's interesting about that power of fairy tale is that even if someone is creating what we might consider a new fairy tale, like something grim, we have some great writers and filmmakers now who make versions of things that absolutely I would call versions of fairy tales. Neil Gaiman, Guillermo del Toro, people like that. And a lot of them, they're looking for the same kind of thing. Can we find the characters? Can we find where the tests are? Can we find how people's choices reflect who they are as a person? And does that revelation of who they are as a person help us see how they end up in the end in a way that we walk away really thinking about something very deeply? And so whether we are in the middle of Pan's Labyrinth from Guillermo del Toro, or if we are in one of Neil Gaiman's graphic novels, or we're wandering in something grim, we have things we look for that give us that fairy tale. And there's a frame to fairy tales. Everybody knows that we need a once upon a time. And it may not be it may not be exactly once upon a time. In fact, there's something on Twitter called Fairy Tale Tuesdays that I spend way too much time on. But one Tuesday, people from all over the world shared what their version of Once Upon a Time was on how they began their cultural fairy tales. So whether it was a long time ago, my favorite one came out of Africa. There once was, or maybe there wasn't. I loved it. And, but they always have a frame. Wherever you are, you know what your frame is. You know what to expect when you hear that beginning frame. So for us, it's Once Upon a Time. And Something Grim gave us that immediately, that even as we were standing and waiting for the show to begin, we could look at the pillars and we saw the scroll and we saw the Once Upon a Time. And the scroll takes us back too, because there's the other aspect of fairy tale, that even if it looks like we're in our world, we're not in our world. Fairy tales always take place in their own world, and in their own world, their actions have the right kinds of consequences, or they have some consequences that work at the rules of their world. And so we already see from the scroll that we're going to be stepping out of our world and into something else. So such great choices immediately to immerse us into this place before anybody's made any noise. We've already been placed there. And so then as we are read to by the narrator, we know now that we're going to be presented. Again, there's that kind of third person that's also very typical in most fairy tales perspective of setting everything up for us so we can kind of see objectively what everybody's going to be doing. And then as we move in through this wonderful blend of light and of sound, of moments where we sit and watch clips of videos so that we can really get to know the characters. Again, Something Grim did a really good job of noticing how most of the time in fairy tales, people don't have names, they have titles. And the reason for that is that we understand how people are supposed to act in certain roles. So if we have a king, we know how a good king should act in a fairy tale. We know a good king should be generous. We know a good king should care about the welfare of all of that kingdom. We know that a good king should be loving and kind. We know that a good king shouldn't be greedy and miserly and not care if the kingdom is starving. So if we say king, then because fairy tales are very short, we can unpack everything we know about kings and now weigh that person against that person's actions. The same with the queen, the same with the cook, the same with the farmer, and even the same with the child. We understand how children should be, how they act, and how they work, and we understand too how the nobility should act and behave and how they work. And so something Grimm did a great job with giving us those roles so that we could then say, I know how that person should act in a fairy tale. I know what that person should do. But then as we continued to move, and I loved that when the child was with the farmer was the part when we were starting to move and we started to weave around, because really both are being tested at that point. The farmer and the child are both being tested a bit. The farmer has already made some very dire choices in order to manipulate and take the child, manipulated the cook into thinking this was just a joke, taking the child of the king, letting it look like the queen had done it, all of those different things that are happening in that moment. And yet the farmer just keeps wanting more and more and more. And we see how the farmer's treating the child. So as the child is growing up, what we're seeing then too is that once the child realizes the power that that child has, the child begins to rethink that relationship and rethink how things are supposed to be. And is this how someone should treat a child? And of course, it's not. So even if by the time the farmer had the child, even if the farmer had started then to raise that child well, it would still be a different play. But normally in a fairy tale, a person who makes really awful choices is going to keep continuing to make really awful choices. There are only some characters who grow in the course of the fairy tale, and our farmer absolutely is not meant to be one of them, which is perfect. But that affects how the child is. So as we're wandering around and we're learning with the child about how the child's powers work and how the child learns in this kind of environment, for me, one of the biggest moments was the child wanting a friend. And here again, we get the role of friend. And we know what a friend should be. And we know as a friend how we should be with a friend. And so here's a moment where the child has some choices to make as well, because the friend is saying very clearly, I'm afraid. I don't, I don't want to move forward like this right now. Wait a minute. I'm a person here. And so there's some very big moments there, I think, between the child and the friend. And what's interesting then is pretty soon after that, as we're done weaving through these rough terrain parts, the forest version of the fairy tale right there, is where the audience gets to start making a choice too. And I love that the audience gets to make a choice. The audience gets to participate, and then the audience makes a choice, just like the child made a choice at the very end. And it was fun to watch the other people that I was in with, taking this tour with, to see if everybody was going to make the same choice. What were people going to do at the moment they get to choose? And I loved how the wishing well at the end was talking to us and giving context to all of that. That's very Grimm didn't always spell out the morals to their stories. They wanted the stories to really tell the tale themselves and for the morals to be very clear in them. Perrault actually spent time like giving morals at the bottom, like in case you missed it, here's what I really wanted you to know. And the wishing well felt very much like that, in a very good way, of walking away with saying, here's kind of where, this is why we ended up the way we did. Here's where we are right now. And it was a really nice touch at the very end as we're wandering through and we're hearing the wishing well, and the wishing well is contextualizing all of this for us, both within the story and as we're about to be on our way. I certainly thought, as I was listening to the wishing well contextualize all of this for me, I thought we were done, and then we weren't. And then we get that last bit from the farmer, which was perfect. It was a wonderful touch at the end to show again that in these fairy tales, not everyone grows, not everyone learns. Unfortunately, that's another shade of real life.
Just like in real life, many people have yet to grow. Jennifer, Dr. Culver, thank you so much for this time. We have learned so much from you. This has been so delightful to, talk to a historian about, these concepts that sometimes we just take advantage of. Fairy tales have been around for so long, and they're just automatically these lessons and morals are embedded. We hear them over and over. How do we retain them? How do we apply them to life? How do we continue to share this for those that come after us? And, in any given era, how is this information taught to us, displayed to us, And so that's what has been great about this experience with Something Grim, an immersion in, mixed media storytelling, and how it impacts scholars like you who have watched this from page to stage to screen, right? And so I just want to thank you so much for this plethora of knowledge and just your graciousness to share in this time today. And I hope that one day we can be back on stage after a show to talk again in the future about more storytelling that we'll present at Dallas Theater Center.
Thank you so much for having me. And I hope that everyone gets a chance to wander through this fairy tale. And thank you to Dallas Theater Center for taking something on during the pandemic, because times like now is when we need fairy tales and need things to remind us who we are and the things that we care about, and challenging yourselves to find interesting, immersive new ways to do that, but still to do them very safely. Is wonderful. And it was a great opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you so much. For those who tune in, continue to follow us on DallasTheaterCenter.org to learn more about Something Grim and our upcoming shows. Please connect with us on Facebook and on Instagram and Twitter, where you will be able to find information on how to see tickets. We're closing up our show for Something Grim. We hope you're able to catch it, and hopefully you'll be able to catch it digitally if you did not catch it in real life, and experience what Jennifer laid out to us. So thank you, everybody. Have a great night and continue to inspire and engage with the city of Dallas.